In this module, we now turn our attention to ethics, professional standards, and communication, all of which are deeply interconnected in gerontological practice. Communication is not just a technical skill. It promotes autonomy, dignity, informed consent, and trust. Simply put, if we cannot communicate effectively with older adults, we cannot provide ethical care. But having said this, as individuals age, communication abilities may shift. Some changes are gradual and part of normal aging. Others result from disease processes such as dementia or stroke. Distinguishing between these types of changes is essential for anyone working with older clients. In this lecture, we will examine what communication encompasses, how communication changes in normal aging, how communication is affected in pathological conditions, and the ethical implications of how we respond to these changes. Understanding these dynamics prepares us to engage older adults with clarity, respect, and professionalism.
Going through it, you can have it. That's where I'll spend it being. Going through it.
Before examining change, we need to define communication. Communication includes expressive language, including speaking, word choice, and articulation. Receptive language, like listening and comprehension. Nonverbal communication, like facial expressions, tone, and gestures. Pragmatics, or in other words, how language is used socially. Sensory processing, like hearing and vision ability. And cognitive processing, like attention, memory, and interpretation. Communication is therefore multidimensional. It involves the brain, the body, the sensory systems, and the social environment. This complexity explains why communication may be affected by both normal aging and disease processes.
You can have it. That's where
Let's begin with changes that are part of normal aging. It is important to emphasize that normal aging does not eliminate the ability to communicate effectively. However, it may introduce subtle shifts. Let's start with sensory shifts. One of the most common contributors to communication change in later life is hearing loss, particularly presbycusis. High-frequency sounds are often harder to detect. This can make it difficult to distinguish certain consonants, especially in environments with background noise. Importantly, this does not mean the individual cannot understand language. It means the environment may need adjustment. Vision changes may also affect communication, particularly reading small print or detecting subtle facial cues. But in addition to sensory changes, we also see changes in speech and voice. With age, voice pitch may change. Some individuals experience increased breathiness or reduced volume. Articulation may become slightly less precise. However, these changes rarely eliminate intelligibility. They represent adjustments, not losses of communicative capacity. We also may see changes in word retrieval and language. Older adults may experience more frequent tip-of-the-tongue moments. Word retrieval may take slightly longer, especially for proper nouns or recently learned information. At the same time, vocabulary often remains stable or even improves. Crystallized intelligence, accumulated knowledge, and language ability remain strong. This reflects a pattern we discussed in Module 3. Slower processing speed does not equal diminished intelligence. And, well, speaking of processing speed, comprehension of rapid or complex speech may require more time. Multi-step instructions delivered quickly may be harder to process. However, when information is presented clearly and at a reasonable pace, comprehension is typically preserved. The key theme across all these points is this: normal communication changes are gradual, variable, and often manageable with minor adjustments.
you can have it. That's where
Now, let's contrast these normal shifts with pathological communication changes. Pathological changes are typically more pronounced, progressive or sudden, and associated with functional impairment. Let's start with communication changes tied to dementia. With dementia, communication challenges reflect underlying neurodegenerative processes. Early signs may include persistent word finding difficulty, repetition, and difficulty following complex conversations. As dementia progresses, language may become less coherent, individuals may struggle to follow narrative threads, and comprehension of abstract concepts may decline. Unlike normal aging, these changes worsen over time and interfere with daily functioning. Stroke is another pathological condition which can cause sudden communication impairment through what is known as aphasia. Aphasia is a disorder wherein communication ability is impacted by brain damage. It not only impacts a person's speech, but also their ability to write and understand verbal and written communication. As such, aphasia may affect expressive language, receptive language, or both. Because the primary cause of aphasia is stroke or head injury, these changes are typically focal and abrupt rather than gradual. Although I'll note that there are some degenerative disorders which can cause aphasia that are slow progressing, and in these instances, changes in communication patterns may be more gradual in nature. In a previous module, we also discussed Parkinson's disease, an example of a motor disorder. Such disorders which impact motor ability can affect speech production. Voice may become softer, more monotone, more rapid, or more slurred. Again, I want to emphasize here, these reflect neurological pathology, not normal aging. There is another dimension to communication in later life: how others respond to older adults. Research describes what is sometimes called the communication predicament of aging. When younger individuals assume an older adult is experiencing cognitive decline, they may modify their speech in ways that are patronizing. This includes using overly simplified language, exaggerated tones, infantilizing terms like sweetie or dear, and speaking loudly without necessity. This pattern, sometimes called elder speak, may be well intentioned, but it can undermine dignity and autonomy, especially for older adults who are not experiencing cognitive decline, or for those who do not require any adjustments in communication style. Importantly, communication adjustments should be responsive to actual need, not based on stereotypes and ageist assumptions. Ethical communication requires distinguishing accommodation from condescension. In real-world settings, normal and pathological changes may intersect. For example, an individual with mild hearing loss may also develop early cognitive impairment, or sensory loss may exacerbate cognitive burden, or environmental noise may make normal processing changes appear pathological. This reinforces the importance of careful assessment. Occasional word-finding difficulty is normal. Persistent progressive impairment that interferes with daily life is not. As you likely already know, or are more aware of through this lecture, communication is central to ethical care. 4 core ethical principles are especially relevant when thinking about how we communicate with older adults. First, we have to think about respect for autonomy. Older adults must be able to express preferences and participate in decisions. Communication strategies must facilitate understanding, not override it. Next, we must be mindful of dignity. We must avoid infantilization and avoid assumptions of incompetence. It's important to address the individual directly. Next, we must consider justice, or the ethical concept where others are granted access to things that they have earned or are due. In this way, we have to ensure older adults have access to interpreters, hearing devices, visual supports, and culturally appropriate communication when necessary. And finally, we must also consider non-maleficence. You may have heard versions of this when thinking about doctors' oaths. When a doctor takes an oath to do no harm, they are essentially saying they will adhere to the principle of non-maleficence. This is tied to this lecture in that poor communication can cause harm through misunderstanding, exclusion, or marginalization. Taking these 4 core principles together, we see that professional standards require that we adapt communication in ways that preserve agency and identity. In our next lectures, we will explore specific strategies to enhance communication in both clinical and non clinical settings, and then focus specifically on communication with individuals living with dementia. For now, remember the following: speak clearly, not loudly by default, reduce environmental noise, allow processing time, confirm understanding respectfully, and avoid stereotype driven adjustments. Communication is relational. It is shaped not only by individual ability, but by environmental design and interpersonal respect.
You can pass it.
To summarize, normal aging may introduce sensory and processing changes, but communication capacity often remains strong. Pathological conditions such as dementia and stroke produce more significant and progressive impairments. Ethical gerontological practice requires recognizing these differences and responding appropriately. As you reflect on this lecture, consider: how might subtle age-related assumptions influence the way you communicate with older adults? And how can you ensure your communication preserves dignity and autonomy? This concludes the first lecture for Module 6. If you have any questions about the material covered in this lecture, please contact your instructor for this course. Thanks for watching.
I'll spend a million. Only through it. You can